he suddenly got this feeling of like absolute fear that this thing was, the reason why they couldn't find it was because it was in the air, and it was now over top of them. And he had this incredible sense of fear that if he were to look up, he would see that it was there, and he just couldn't deal with it. So he sort of just kept looking down because he's just so scared. In 1967, a man named R. Greenmayer wrote a letter to prominent UFO researcher and author Cora Lorenzen, detailing a strange experience he had when he was around 12 years old, near his home in Novato, California. APRO investigator Dr. James Harder took great interest in the case, speaking to the witness and even arranging for Greenmayer to speak to clinical psychologist Leslie M. LeCron on September 17, 1968, the transcript of which was printed in the third issue of APRO Reel's newsletter. It was 1958, Novato, California. The witness, R. Greenmayer, then 12, was out with 3 other boys, all of whom were around his age. One of the boys was a close friend. His younger brother was also there, along with his pal from school. Greenmayer opted not to reveal their names, or if he did, it was not disclosed by the investigator. All 4 of them had ventured out to a wooded area to hang out, play tag, etc. The location was walking distance from their homes, and they went there frequently. They had been up in the hills playing on that day, when, at around 1 p.m., they spotted something strange in a ridge across the valley. It wasn't flying, it was above the ground and stationary. You could see it was between us and the trees. We could see the outline, and it was above the ground. It was in a horizontal position, hills curving beneath it. Greenmayer described that the craft was silvery in color, saucer-shaped, and apparently glowing. I believe that it glowed due to the sunlight, power, or whatever. It really appeared to be reflecting sunshine. You would expect to see shadows somewhere, like orange, like underneath or something. There was no shadows visible. At that point, the boys made a decision to alert their parents to the strange object. They proceeded to run home. We became very excited about the thing and went to tell our mothers. They just laughed it off. They didn't believe us. Greenmayer wasn't 100% clear on the progression of the events to follow, only that after their parents shrugged them off, he and the other boys hatched a plan to go back to the gully and try to, quote, capture the flying saucer. They armed themselves with BB guns and headed back out. He could not recall if they went directly to the spot where they saw the craft, or if they went to a spot in the hills that would afford them the best observation point to see the object. So we got up there, we were looking around, we didn't see anything. They spent a few minutes looking for the object, but it was gone. Afterwards, the 4 boys stood around talking and joking. They thought about going and telling some of their school friends that there was a UFO in the hills as a prank. They figured we'd, make like it was a flying saucer up there. Scare some of our friends or something like that. We were fooling around up there. Then the beep started. While we were looking around, we heard a beeping noise, like a busy signal on a phone. But there was something else. Greenmayer suddenly had the very real sense that the strange object that they had observed earlier was now directly over them. I believe before we heard that beeping, I felt there was something over my head. I felt like there was something directly above us, straight ahead of me. I, sort of wanted to look up, but I didn't dare because I was scared there would be something up there. So I asked one of my friends to look up. and he looked up, but when he did, he closed his eyes. He thought the light, was coming from the usual sunlight. He said there was nothing there, but I still didn't want to look up. His sense of fear only increased with each passing second. I felt there was something above me, and at one point, you know how you get those goose pimply, your hair stands on end? Well, I got the same feeling. My hair stood on end, and then I guess it was then that we heard the beeping noise. It was around this time somewhere or other we felt the sun was exceptionally bright when I closed my eyes. Greenmayer claims that he and his friends suddenly found the brightness of the sun, or what they thought was the sun, had become nearly intolerable. They kept their eyes shut to shield them from the brightness. It was a summer day and the sunlight was so bright that I had trouble keeping my eyes open. I wanted to leave, but I also didn't want to keep my eyes open. So I looked down the path and checked it for snakes. Then I walked down the path a few steps and opened my eyes again. I was surprised to find that I had covered about 50 feet in about 5 steps. Again there was a beeping noise, and I asked if any of my friends had heard anything or seen anything. They said that they had their eyes closed. After standing around, nothing happening, the friends decided to try to follow the beeping noise to its source. The boys knew that there was nothing up there except Mr. Benson's cows, so they couldn't understand what would be making this sound. We couldn't figure out why there would be any beeping at all, so we went over there. Greenmayer claims that as he walked, for some reason, he suddenly began to feel fatigued. I felt tired and sleepy or something, and laid down on the grass. An odd detail in hindsight was that only Greenmayer felt this sudden sense of being drained of energy. We never reached the spot where we were going originally, so they were poking around in the grass. I guess I was still feeling that it was too bright or something. I didn't want to look up. I would look down on the ground before I would look up. So my friends continued off in a different direction, where they could look around the trees. At some point, the friends rushed back down the hill, insisting to Greenmayer that the flying saucer was, quote, over there. I didn't believe them. I figured they were kidding, he recalled, thinking back to their earlier conversations about pranking their school friends. The friends didn't seem to care much about convincing him, and started quickly back up the hill to see the object. And this is when things went from strange to downright chilling. Assuming his friends were attempting to pull one over on him, Greenmayer continued to lay in the grass on his stomach. He put his head down, and when he looked back up, I looked back up, and I noticed that they, my friends, were all on the ground. I figured maybe they were just playing pranks with me, so I didn't pay any attention, and I looked up again, and now this is where my story is getting kind of funny. Now, I seem to remember that there were other people standing around them who were dressed up in weird costumes. You know, like spacemen. I figured it was just somebody trying to play a joke. Somebody else was trying to scare me. Greenmayer got the sense that the costume people did not see him as he was lying in the grass. He elected to remain still. He admits that he wasn't exactly frightened, but he did sense that something was off about the whole situation. I didn't want to look up to take a good square look at them. I was assuming that they were somebody from over a hill to us, dressed and trying to pull a Halloween trick. Greenmayer admits that he was beginning to feel confused, and that his memories of what happened next were, quote, hazy. I don't remember for sure whether somebody approached me and then went back, or approached all the way up to me first, but I do remember that there was a pair of feet standing there, sort of gray boots or something, like dark gray. I was under the assumption at the time that it probably was one of my friends, or at least that was what I wanted to believe anyway. Without looking up, he asked a friend who the costume people were. There was no answer. Greenmayer became angry, assuming the boots belonged to one of the costume people. I told him whoever he was going to lose some teeth. So I looked up. That was his last memory. When Greenmayer came to, he was no longer laying in the grass. He found himself standing in a hollow space in the trees on the edge of the forest. His friends were there with him. They all noticed that their BB guns, which they had been carrying, were now suddenly gone. The friends went to look for them. They eventually stumbled across them in the grass, in about the spot where Greenmayer had observed them laying down earlier. I remember that I found mine, nicknamed Pride and Joy, quicker down the hill. It was in a rather sad shape. It had grass underneath a lever. It was one of those lever action types, you know? It had dry grass crunched up underneath the lever, and the plastic stalk was broken. The plastic was busted. This sent me to thinking. I remember thinking that in the Civil War, that the troops, when they fired their weapons, they would grab them by the musket and swing them like a baseball bat. But if somebody was approaching me from the back, I was thinking that the plastic wasn't heavy enough, as with your woodstock, enough to do that. For some reason, this seemed to trigger a sort of vague memory. It seems that I remembered looking up and seeing something that wasn't quite what you'd expect to see. I looked down and shook my head and looked up again. And then I don't happen to remember exactly what happened, except I was standing up. I seem to remember having either fired at one of these people and it having no effect. I seem to remember that I hit somebody with it, and the others thrashing around. Somehow I lost my weapon. I turned around and I ran and I fell down. And I remember thinking there's something watching me fall, you know? Greenmayer claims that when he and the others came to on the edge of the forest, they could still hear the beeping sound. He asked one of them if they figured out where it was coming from. They indicated to him that they hadn't. Some of the boys still wanted to track down the source, but after finding their guns on the hill, they all collectively agreed to head home. We didn't say a word going down the hill and up the street, and we figured that was kind of odd. You know, there should be something said there. I thought someone should say something funny or something, you know, but nothing happened. When we got home, and our parents asked, quote, "Where have you been all day?" And we were all day. It seemed like only a few minutes. So we went back out to the spot where we originally saw that thing to see if it was still there. There was some reflection left in the late air or something. It was back and at the original position where we saw it in the first place. And that's when we gave up the whole thing. Greenmayer notes that when they saw the object originally, it was around 1 p.m. Upon returning home the second time, despite it feeling only like a few minutes had passed, it was now late afternoon. It was fairly late and the sun was down. Shadows were much longer, he recalled. After that day, Greenmayer refused to go anywhere near the spot. In fact, he and the other boys pretty much stopped speaking to each other. Later that night, his closest friend mentioned to Greenmayer's little sister that they had seen spacemen up on the hill. That was the last time he talked to that friend. It was that immediate. Greenmayer insisted that he didn't like the idea of him trying to scare her, though it seems there was more to this than he initially indicated. It certainly seems beneath the surface, like he was worried that his friend's talk of space people might entice his sister into visiting the spot herself, and to protect her, he cut ties with his friend forever. He couldn't risk her experiencing what they had experienced, even though his memories of the event were wholly vague. It is clear that lingering in the back of his mind was that something terrible had transpired up on that hillside. In the days following the event, Greenmayer developed sores all over his body, and the hair on his head began to fall out. Further, 2 small bruises appeared on his chin that he could not account for. They did not look like insect bites. He began to suffer from a series of bizarre nightmares. In these dreams, he was always laying on a hillside in the grass. He is drawing a picture. Suddenly, a spaceman appears in front of him. He was standing in front of me. I took off running, and in the dream, I fell down and couldn't move my legs. I had trouble moving my arms, but I was completely immobile. I remember I raised my eyes. I remember from the dream that he was above me, man-sized, medium-sized person, you know? And first I thought it was just a monster type, but, it had 3 parallel pipes coming outside his head and down over his back, like a helmet. Large slanted eyes, and, how a cartoon looks like, oval with a black center. That's all I remembered from the dream. A regression session was scheduled with clinical psychologist Leslie M. Lacron 10 years after the experience. Greenmayer recalled being forcibly taken inside a landed craft, like the one he and his friends had observed earlier, and placed on a table where some type of examination was performed on him, including having 2 tubes placed into his chin, for which a blood sample was taken. His memories of the experience, even under hypnosis, were vague. When asked to describe the beings, Greenmayer indicated that they were around 5 feet tall, with large heads, large black slanted eyes, gray skin, and thick, stubby fingers. It should be noted that Greenmayer's description of short, gray-skinned, large black-eyed beings predated the more famous Hills encounter, often cited by skeptics for the origin of the short, gray-skinned, black-eyed type beings described in so many reports. This whole thing has a very dreamlike quality to it. It's staggered the way it's told. He seems to remember certain parts of it, but it's all very dreamlike. He's laying down in the grass, his friends are running around, he's arguing with them about whether or not it was there, even though he had seen it earlier. He thought the light was really bright, but he thought the light was coming from the sun. He never occurred to him that it might have been coming from something else. None of this is normal. What was happening wasn't normal. The witness, when they did the regression around that time, he said that he went back to the location, the hillside where this happened. He hadn't been there in over 10 years. As of the date of the story, him and the other boys hadn't spoken to each other in all that time. They just stopped speaking to each other after the incident on the hillside. And you find that's pretty common in paranormal cases where groups of friends will have an encounter of some kind with Bigfoot or UFO sighting or something else, and all of a sudden right afterwards they just can't be around each other anymore for some reason.